I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the battlefront, analyse one of the main problems with Russian battle tanks, and we interview the independent activist Val Voshchevska on her work and her recent journey back to Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 19th of August, day 177. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, and our guest, Val Voshchevska. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Yeah, hi David. Hi everybody. It's been fairly active 24 hours in Crimea and in the east of the country. So there's a number of blasts. We think at least 4 blasts reported in Crimea at the Belbek Air Base, which is just north of the Black Sea Fleet port of Sevastopol. That looks to be in a similar vein to the attacks we've seen in recent days. No attribution yet. I'll come on to. I've just been in a background brief with a Western official. I'll talk about what he said briefly shortly, but no attribution yet for those attacks. There's also some confusion. There are other reported blasts. There's images on social media of very large fires and explosions in the Belgorod Oblast. So Belgorod is a town about 50 km north of Kharkiv, so inside Russia. Is the Belgorod town, and in the Belgorod region there seem to have been two other reported blasts up there, an ammunition dump, and there's reports even of an air base, but we're not sure about that. But those are unconfirmed. The blasts in Crimea do seem to be confirmed. They were referred to by the Western officials, so we think that has happened. As I say, as for attribution, we're not sure. Although the Western official was talking about these attacks. And saying there's a certain, quote, ambiguity, unquote, about the attacks. He says it's correct to assume it's some form of Ukrainian activity behind enemy lines, behind Russian lines. And he said, that the Western official said that what we've seen in recent days is this is a quote, application of novel capabilities by brave people operating behind enemy lines. So interesting there. Unquote. So for me, interesting, not only referring to the brave people operating behind enemy lines, because we long suspected it. We've had supposed Ukrainian officials talking to the New York Times saying that it was special forces, but no one's actually kind of come out and said it. And I'm sticking with the convention. I'm talking about a Western official. I'm not going to say who he or she was, but interesting to have this for me. And you can choose to believe me or not if you wish, but I know who the Western official is, and I then choose to believe that if they say that there are brave people operating behind enemy lines, there are. But you can take your own view on that. But the other part of that comment there about the novel capabilities, I thought that was an interesting phrase. So maybe the suggestion that there have been loitering munitions or some form of drone activity, either as well as or instead of ground forces. I think we can discount partisan, so we're kind of talking special forces. That has been mentioned, that has been mooted. So maybe there's some kind of drone activity, loitering munitions, but it looks like it's firming up this idea that there are Ukrainian special forces, as in militarized, not partisan activity going on there. Elsewhere, again, confusing reports, but it looks like there was some activity last night around the Kerch Bridge. So this is the bridge to the east of Crimea, linking back to the Russian into the Russian mainland there. It looks like there's a lot of Russian air defense fire in response to what we don't know. Confusing reports that there were some explosions. I think I've not seen any evidence of that. I've only seen it in print, and I think these explosions may have been the blast of the air defense missiles going off. Now, whether that was reacting to drones or some other, it doesn't look like munitions were coming in, but if it was drones, that again is quite interesting, because is this a reconnaissance mission by Ukraine, or actually, think about it, a very, very cheap way of getting Russian air defense systems to light themselves up, reveal their positions, use their increasingly precious ammunition. So we don't know what's happening at the Kerch Bridge. We don't know what's happening inside Belgrade or in Belgrade inside Russia, but there do seem to be, we can confirm there are those blasts in Crimea. I'll just take a little pause there before coming back.
Thanks very much, Dom. I've just got one question for you, actually. It was on our notes for the other day. It was a note from the British Ministry of Defence that said that it wondered about an explanation for why the Russian military forces have been losing so many tanks, and they said it was potentially down to the faulty ERA protection on the tanks. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What do they mean?
Yeah, so this came out of, I think it was either yesterday or Wednesday's defence intelligence brief from the British Ministry of Defence, talking about how Russian ERA has been possibly to blame for a lot of the loss of the tanks. Now, ERA is explosive reactive armour. These are the big boxes, the kind of shoebox-sized things you see bolted on to the outside, mainly of the turret of a tank, but also over the front of the hull as well. They used to be referred to as armadillo armor. It that makes the tank look like an armadillo, look like armadillo shell. But explosive reactive armor are boxes with basically two very, very heavy metal plates with a load of explosive in the middle. Broadly, please bash me on the DMs if I've got the sort of chemistry wrong. But essentially, that's it. Because what happens is when a round fired at a tank, if there is no ERA and you've just got the metal hull of the tank or the turret, the round will hit that and hopefully penetrate that and get into and through, ideally through the turret, through the other side. So what ERA does is when the round hits it is a blast, and it seeks to physically push away the incoming round. So a round hits the ERA, and then there's a rapid explosion from the box, and it blasts. There's a plate against the hull or against the turret, so that it doesn't actually, you don't damage yourself, but it pushes away the projectile that's coming in. Now, what we're seeing is in the T-72 turret throwing competition that we've been watching for the last 6 months, so many of these turrets are landing and they've got their ERA boxes intact. So either they're not working, or there's the suggestion that they've just not been maintained properly. They don't work. They're very old. The explosive either doesn't work at all or has possibly been sold by. We know there's widespread corruption through the Russian system, and that goes for the logistics system as well. So maybe the stuff's been sold, but it's not working. If you think about, the way to defeat ERA is by having two warheads in the missile that comes in. One blast then sets off the ERA, and a microsecond later, the second blast then goes through the exposed hull or turret. Now, some of the munitions that are being fired at Russian tanks only have one warhead, so they should be defeated by ERA, and they're not. They are not being defeated. They're getting through. They're knocking out all these tanks. So ERA is not working. I don't think I've seen any evidence at all of any ERA that has worked. Caveat there, of course, it's mainly Ukraine that's putting out on social media footage of these attacks, and they are unlikely to post footage of an unsuccessful attack against a tank if the ERA did work. That said, I just don't think it is. I just don't think this stuff is working properly. I don't think it's either there, it's been taken out and sold, or it's just not been maintained and it's not working. So DI, UK Defence Intelligence, were suggesting that the failure of ERA has been one of the prime factors in Russia's loss of, I think the latest estimate is almost 2,000 tanks. I mean, countless other armoured fighting vehicles and infantry carriers and what have you, but just the tanks alone, I think they're getting close to about 2,000. So when you see this old expression, ERA, that's explosive reactive armour that goes on the outside of the tank, on the hull and the turret.
Thank you very much for that, Dom. Do you have any other updates for us, or shall we welcome Val?
Well, just very quickly, so just to finish off what the Western official was saying, he was briefing on the Black Sea Fleet and saying the Black Sea Fleet is essentially, in terms of military effect, is nullified. It lost its flagship Moskva many weeks ago. They've lost control of Snake Island, and in the attack on Saki airfield, the Western official says that over half of the naval aviation assets, as in the planes, were destroyed. So the Black Sea Fleet is largely a spent force. It's still got a lot of caliber missiles that we see occasionally being fired into Odessa and the south of the country. So it's not that it doesn't have any military effect, but it looks like the potential threat to Odessa has largely been removed. And just finally on Zaporizhzhia, on the nuclear power plant, so you would have seen the the shocking warnings, Russia warning that Ukraine is about to launch a strike today or tomorrow on Zaporizhzhia, which we are largely interpreting as a possible false flag attack, which would be very, very concerning. The Western official says that Zaporizhzhia has now become symbolic to both sides, because both sides know that there's a worldwide audience looking at this in the same way as there was Snake Island was symbolic and had the world's attention, and the grain issue, equally symbolic, and the world's attention was drawn to that. We now have the same with the nuclear issue, and both sides are trying to create the conditions for the other side to take the blame. And in particular, although it's extremely unlikely that anybody would be stupid enough to fire directly at the power plant, but the Western official was saying there's particular concern about threats to the power supply, which could impact the cooling units and the vital sort of electrical supply to that side of the plant. Much as we spoke about a couple of days ago with our correspondent Dan Capuro. So great concern there about Zaporizhzhia. And finally. It was talking about these whatever they are, partisan / special forces attacks, and whether or not in any sham vote in the Russian occupied areas of Ukraine for the Luhansk, Donetsk, or the Kherson region to become part of Russia, if there were attacks in those areas by Ukraine after such an illegitimate vote, would Russia deem that to be an attack on Russian soil, which we know is viewed as an escalatory measure? And the view from the Western official was no, we don't think Russia would view it as such, given the sort of pinpoint nature of some of these attacks in Crimea, and the fact that Ukraine said that they're not going to change their posture after any kind of ridiculous vote in these areas. So we don't think that even if Russia claims to have incorporated these regions into the country as a whole, any continued assault there would be deemed too provocative. But we're trying to second guess Russian thoughts here, which is always a dangerous game.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nichols. There, it's very happy to reintroduce actually, Val Voshchevska. Val, you've spoken to us a few times before, fairly early on in this podcast's life. Val is an independent activist. She co-founded Ukrainian Spaces. So if you're looking for more Twitter Spaces and podcasts to listen to, I'd highly recommend Ukrainian Spaces, co-hosted by Val. And she's an activist with Women's March Ukraine. Val, for our listeners who maybe haven't heard you since you were on a few months ago, can you just reintroduce yourself again? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to the last few months.
So I think you've given quite a good introduction of who I am, but I'm Val. I'm Ukrainian from Kyiv originally. I live in London at the moment. And I'm also, apart from the things that you've outlined, I'm an audience strategist and sort of a social media manager in my previous life, having worked for Newsweek and Amnesty. So at the moment, I'm focusing on helping Ukraine independently and helping some civil society organizations in Ukraine to fundraise, as well as just in general do a little bit more educational work around Ukraine to Western audiences, but also audiences within Ukraine. I was just, and I know you'll ask me about this later, but I was just in Ukraine last week, and I'm now back to London. So just in the process of processing a lot of things since I've returned. So that's what I've been doing, and.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about that? How did you get back, and what did you see? Where did you go? I mean, we've got so many questions, but maybe start with that. How did you actually get back into the country?
Yeah, of course. So I was actually, everyone was asking me this before, but I was in London on the 24th of February when everything kicked off, and I was lucky enough to have my parents here with me, who came to visit me for a couple of days, actually for a week before. They came with their little, suitcase for holiday, but it ended up staying here permanently as things kicked off. And this was my first time going back since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I was actually visiting my friend, because a lot of my friends are displaced, obviously, in Poland and in a lot of other places around Europe and outside of Europe. But I was visiting my friend in Poland just to see how she is and how life looks like for her. She escaped as well from Kiev in the early days of February, when everything started really escalating. So it was really important for me to spend some time with her. But I also I've, as I'm sure if you speak to quite a few Ukrainians, will all say that sort of going back home has always been an extremely important goal for many of us who haven't been back since everything started. So I essentially, after visiting her in Krakow, took a train to Lviv. And the train journey that everyone does to the border, and then the switch over there, and then the train from the Polish-Ukrainian border to Lviv. And it was actually, I don't know if other people had the same experience, but it was a really interesting experience for me, because it felt like everyone on the train was like a friend. Everyone was talking to each other. Everyone was, sharing their stories. Everyone was sort of helping each other. And it was a very interesting and hopeful first experience of Ukraine again, even in this context of, pain and suffering within the country. But it just really was interesting to see how people interacted with each other, with me, how I interacted with people. And it really, everything that we've been seeing in the media, but also, just in general from interactions with Ukrainians, like, to me, came true on that trip, on that journey across the border. And it was just really nice to see.
What kind of stories did you hear, and how did it feel for you going back to your home for the first time?
So I'll start with your second question. For me, I was extremely worried and anxious in the run up to going to Ukraine, and I spoke to a friend of mine as well who's been to a lot of different sort of countries at war and in active war, in the context of active war, and he said that actually before you go is always the most nerve-wracking part of journeys like this, which I really felt. And I was actually waiting. I was gonna do the trip initially with my parents as well, so they were gonna meet me in Krakow, and then we would drive. But they were delayed, and just this anxiety before going back home was completely eating, me alive. And I just booked a ticket the next day, and I was like, I need to go. I just need to rip the Band-Aid off and see what it's actually like there for myself. I was, of course, scared, unlike people who escaped Ukraine after the full-scale invasion. I think they had a bit more understanding, not much more understanding of what the country was like. But for me, I just didn't know what to expect. And that was really, anxiety provoking for me. So that's why I just booked a ticket and decided to as I said, rip the Band-Aid off and see for myself and experience Ukraine for myself. And as my friend who explained this to me said, it was completely, once I crossed the border, like, the feeling completely passed, and it just felt really, wonderful to be back home and to be with Ukrainians in Ukraine. And so the stories that I heard, actually loads of interesting stories. I think I'll highlight one. And my favorite stories, this was already as I crossed the border, so the train between Poland and Ukraine after the border. And I sat next to this 8-year-old Roma girl whose name was Alona. And she wanted to just chat to me. She was like, "What's your name? Where are you going? What's your story?" And she was really cute. She was asking me loads about, I was asking her where she's going, and she said, "I'm going to Ukraine." And I was like, "Okay, where in Ukraine are you going?" And she was like, "Well, this place, Ukraine. I live in Ukraine, and there's this. My house has this my house has this blue door that is slightly broken at the moment, but that's Ukraine. That's Ukraine." And I was like, "Okay." She basically was just really sweet and told me all her life stories and told me about what she loves to cook, and she only spoke Ukrainian, so I had to really like brush off my Ukrainian quickly. She was asking me loads of things about, like, what do I like cooking, and then I asked her, and she was like, "I love to cook borscht." And it was really interesting to hear this from her as an 8-year-old. So that was a really sweet encounter, and she sat with me the whole time. And her mother, obviously, and siblings were there, and they were also going back home. And she told me that her father was actually in the army, fighting in the army, and protecting Ukraine. And it was just really nice to hear, everything from the perspective of a child, and it just really like calmed me down as well when I was going back home. So yeah, that's there were a few others, but I mean everyone was just sharing their experiences. There was a woman from Kharkiv who was also with me in the same like carriage, and we started talking, and she's moved to Kiev now. A lot of people are either moving to Kiev or coming back from like Lviv to Kiev, because a lot of people are starting to think about like actually starting new lives already, which I think is quite hopeful as well. And like, where are most opportunities to like start business or to go to work? And it seems like Kiev is really, because of that, starting to revive as a city.
So what were your experiences when you got to Kyiv itself? I mean, I'm curious to know if you're okay talking about it. When did you first start seeing the signs of the conflict? What did you see?
Well, so, really good question. So my parents ended up meeting me in Lviv a couple of days later, and in Lviv I actually have been to Lviv maybe twice before, so like in my whole life, and it was just really interesting to see how the city lived. And I actually went again with my friend who was there to one of the hospitals that has all of the sort of civilian patients there, and we actually ended up going to one of the wards to talk to people and sort of meet some people who were suffered from bombings and things like that, who had amputations or were waiting to see what was going to happen with them, and that was the first time I was like, whoa, okay, now it feels real. People's stories, like there was a woman from Avdiivka, there was another man who just came to the hospital, was obviously, he came to the hospital 2 days prior to that from the Donetsk region. And it was just, really hit me then. And so as we were driving to Kiev, I met my parents in Lviv, and we drove to Kiev. Last time I was in Kiev, by the way, was in January, right before everything kicked off. I was planning my wedding in August in the center of the city, and so this was quite emotional for me to go back. What was it? August, and so apart from this hospital visit, the second time I was like, whoa. And Kiev, obviously for me, I used to go back every couple of months, and as we were driving into Kiev, and I'm sure people who have done the same thing will understand, but the Zhytomyr highway is just really intense to see. And it's sort of like you have this like dissonance, because you're like, what, I'm home, and yet I'm seeing these destroyed buildings and like civilian buildings and shopping centers, and everything was just like, you could see it. And for those who don't know, Zhytomyr, basically highway, is the part that the Russian troops that did get sort of close to Kiev, that's where they had their time destroying things and killing people, and it was like on the way to Bucha and Irpin. So yeah, that was, it hit me hard when I saw a lot of those things. And but then again, as soon as you drive into Kiev, the mood sort of changes, and you see people on the streets and cars, and the only thing that will probably give it away is that there's like a little bit less people, and that the statues are like covered, so you can't see them, with like sandbags and other things that protect the statues around the monuments and statues around Kiev. But apart from that, it's straight away like, it was this like, you go from seeing this mass destruction on the highway to going back into the city, and the city is sort of how you remember it, more or less, with a few changes. But I also am very aware that, whenever I say that Kiev is getting back to normal, I know that there's a lot of places that aren't. And so it's also this sort of almost, I don't know, guilt for even thinking in this way of like, wow, I'm so happy Kiev is going back to the way that it was, but just being aware that the war is very far from over. And the thing that you could really notice as well from having conversations with people and so on, and within Kiev, was that you can really see like the men who have gone to join the army. Some of my friends have gone. You can see really like a big gap in having those people around, the people that you're used to having around. A lot of them are fighting, and it just brings you back to sort of reality as well. And obviously the air raid sirens every so often. When I was there a couple of the days, it was like every 2 hours. I think there was one day that it was like every 2 to 3 hours. And that really also reminds you that like everything's not okay, which I think the other thing, and maybe you'll ask me about this later, but I think the thing I realized when I left Ukraine was the amount of pressure that people are under constantly, because it's like people are particularly in Kiev, they're like trying to live life the way that they can, but there's always this like layer of uncertainty and anxiety that like covers that on top of your daily life, because you just don't know what's going to happen at any moment. And I was talking to some friends as well, and they were like, yeah, we've all become like fatalists, whatever happens, and we'll just have to deal with it, which I think is like a very different mood to how it was in the beginning, at least from my conversations with people.
Thanks very much for that, Val. I'd just like to echo something you said about coming in on the Zhytomyr highway. That's the route Dom and I took to go into Kyiv a few weeks ago, and it's exactly what you say, isn't it? It's a sort of ghostly experience as the light falls of the ruined houses and the ruined sort of bridges and everything sort of looming out of the darkness. And Dom, I don't know if you want to add to this at all, but our guide who was sort of taking us through there did sort of mention, the tanks got to this point and then they were stopped, and he gave us a sort of it was very, very eerie. Val, what was different to what you maybe expected about going back, and was there anything that surprised you about what you found in Ukraine?
That's a really good question. Well, I mean, Kiev less so. I think Kiev was pretty much what I expected. I think Lviv was very different. This is probably not. I mean, Lviv is like living life, and there's restaurants open, and everything's open, and people are there. There's like, including like, which I think to a degree is probably problematic, some tourists there from outside of Ukraine and things like that. And like Lviv really surprised me. When I first arrived, I was like, whoa, this is like not what I expected, because everyone's like out and about doing their own stuff and, living life as though nothing happened. That's first kind of thing for me. And then the second thing, I don't know, I expected people to be a bit more kind of, I don't know if you guys had the same experience, but like with the air raid sirens, at first I just expected people to be like going to bomb shelters or, hiding and things like that. But actually, like at this point, at least in Lviv and Kiev, obviously not in other places, but people are like really almost like relaxed about a lot of these things. And I was feeling a bit like uneasy about it. But that was the second thing. And then the last thing that I did not expect is, and I think for me, the moment it hit me is when I walked into my house, like my family home. It was just the same as in January before, like everything was the same. And I think when you go into like your room, like, and it was like my childhood room, and you see like everything the way that it was, but that it's not the same because of what is happening in the country. It's like, it really is like a weird feeling that I can't really explain, but that was really surprising to me, because I thought everything was different. Like I thought everything would be different. Everything I experienced before would change, but it actually didn't. And that was, I think, what was quite tough as well. It was a good feeling and a tough feeling at the same time, if that makes any sense.
I think so, yeah. Can I ask, what was it like meeting your friends and your loved ones when you went back? What kind of things did you talk about? And was there anything that they said that you had to process, or was it almost like slipping back into old times with them?
Well, I think I'm still processing a lot of things. You were asking me before when we were chatting, like, talk a little bit about how you're processing what you've experienced. And I do have to say, like, it's been a week since I've been back, and it's been quite intense. Like, there's been a lot of thoughts and feelings and emotions that have like come all at once, and I'm just taking some time out to really process how I felt, how I feel. But I think in terms of meeting family and friends, it was obviously, my family, some of them left and then came back since the beginning of the war, but my uncle was there the whole time. And we went to see him, and he was just, the one thing I noticed is that people really do want to share their experiences. And I don't know if that's just people I was around, but people do really want to talk about what they went through, which I think is actually healthy. It would have been way worse if people didn't. Because, sometimes you're like, oh, should I ask? Should I not ask? Like, do I want to like re-traumatize them and things like that? But what I found was that people did want to talk. Well, at least, as I said, my uncle and family members and friends about what they went through, how it was, what they experienced, what they saw, what they heard. So I guess that was really interesting for me and yeah, therapeutic as well to see that they were opening up and not bottling up all these emotions and thoughts and feelings. And then just really thinking about as well, people do really believe that people do want to stay in Kiev. People do want to rebuild in Kiev. And, not many people who are there now want to ever leave again, even those who left before. So I think that was quite interesting to hear and see. And then the thing that I said was like this like fatalistic approach to life sort of was quite interesting for me to hear from people that like basically like if something happens, it happens and we'll have to deal with it, because as we saw, like we can't predict how certain individuals behave in this world, so we might as well just take it one step at a time. And that was really interesting to hear from people who are there like 24/7. But I do wonder, this like constant level of low-key pressure, I do wonder like how it's having an effect on everyone, because I really felt it when I left Ukraine. I was like, as soon as I crossed the border, I was like, I don't know why. Not that I obviously really want to go back and it was amazing, but you just realize that people are like operating under a constant feeling of, unease, if that makes sense, even if it doesn't show.
No, absolutely. I've heard very similar things from quite a few people we've been speaking to. When you were leaving, when you crossed the border and you're heading back to London, what did you make of your experience there? How was it readjusting to your life? How is it readjusting to your life in London? I mean, do you feel changed by this?
100%. And you know what this might not be a popular thing to say, but and I'm sure many people have said something similar in relation to guilt before. I think many of us who were abroad, particularly those who were abroad even before everything happened, before the 24th of February, we were experiencing quite significant guilt about not doing enough, not saying enough, not stepping up to protecting our country. And life kind of stopped in a way, because if we did things that were not to help Ukraine and Ukrainian people, it felt really selfish. And what I think really changed for me this time around was going to Ukraine and seeing that people are actually trying to live their lives, even if people are trying to take time out to do routine things, trying to rebuild how they spend their days and things like that. And it really it kind of felt like it was like okay for me. It feels like it's now okay for me. I'm obviously not forgetting about Ukraine and not stopping doing what I'm doing, but I can now take time out for myself as well to recharge. And because I saw that people back at home were doing that, and it wasn't like this constant, people weren't living constantly in horror and awfulness. They were actually trying to do things that made life feel normal, which is what I think I will feel less guilty about doing now whilst I'm outside of Ukraine. So that was one of my biggest takeaways.
Thanks, Val. Just two questions from me, and then I'll ask Dom if he has any as well. One is, I mean, it's been talked about in the media, I think, the past couple of weeks, of people in Europe and further abroad starting to lose interest in the war. It appears slightly less in the newspapers and online. How do you think we can fight that? What would you say to the people who are starting to lose interest?
Well, I think you're totally right that it is happening, and I think a lot of Ukrainians have struggled with coming to terms with that. I guess it's unfortunate but natural progression of how people's attention spans, like how people behave in terms of their attention span. So it's been quite tough for a lot of us to come to terms with it. And like sometimes you're sitting there like, I think I tweeted about it the other day, like, is my content just not good enough? Is it me being shadow banned on Instagram, or have people just lost interest in what's happening? And I think actually, well, maybe today's quite a good example, I think, of how we can bring people's attention back to it. Because I think, Dom, when you were talking about the sort of, hard facts of what's happening and sort of the military strategies and things like that, was really interesting for me personally to listen to, but I'm sure for a lot of other people as well. And then having, someone like myself or other Ukrainians also bringing the human aspect of like life in Ukraine and people's feelings and emotions and how it affects everyday life for people in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, and the stories of people who you meet. Bringing those two together, to me, seems like the best sort of way forward for what we're trying to do. And it's going to be tough. Like, I think what we need to accept is that it's going to be tough to bring back attention in the same way that we did have it on Ukraine. But I think we just need to keep doing what we have been doing. And also the other thing is just, this is more a message for, I guess, fellow Ukrainians, is that obviously, this constant pressure, constant feeling of guilt, all of these things have made us really sort of tired almost, which is natural, right? Like burnt out, tired, and all of these things. So I even feel that way. Like I don't really, at the moment, I'm like, I really want to continue doing my work. And I've been doing a lot of like educational work on my Instagram and Twitter and things like that. And I just don't have ideas about what else I can talk about right now to bring people's interest back. But I think what we also need to acknowledge is that we need to like recharge a little bit as well. And the ideas and all those tools to bring the attention back to Ukraine will come. We just need to, take some time to think about ourselves as well. As tough as that might be, I think that's also one of the sort of lessons of my trip back home, that I've learned that, if we keep going the same way that we've been going, like, we're gonna not be able to continue for much longer. And now we're all realizing that it's going to be a long-term thing. So taking some time out to really think about what we're doing and how we're doing it is super important. So yeah.
Thanks, Val. Just one more question from me. Having been back and seen and travelled across the country and been to Kyiv and seeing your friends and family and seeing the atmosphere in Ukraine, what would you want people listening who haven't been or who've never been, what would you want them to understand about Ukraine right now?
Well, I think a lot of things, obviously, and we've been doing a lot of these, a lot of us Ukrainians have been talking about a lot of different sort of aspects of Ukraine and being Ukrainian. And I think for people who haven't been or who are not going there yet, is just, going back to your question prior to this, is like, keep focusing on Ukraine, even if it seems like life is going back to normal. Well, it isn't for a lot of people in Ukraine, but in some areas it is. Even though that's what you may be seeing or hearing from people like me and others, it doesn't mean that people in other parts of Ukraine are not still, experiencing extreme levels of violence and war, and Russia's not stopping what they're doing. They're just changing tactic. And, it's just really important to not be, well, first that is not to be, but seeing that life continues doesn't mean that the war is less intense. That's one thing. And then the other thing is also, and this goes back to kind of, a lot of people criticizing you, some Western people I've seen. And this was also, one of the criticisms for the Vogue cover of Olena Zelenska, that like, there's a war raging and people are dying. Meanwhile, like, the first lady is doing God knows what and doing photo shoots. But it's like, what I want people to realize is that we need to do things as well that are not related to the war, that might seem, well, we need to continue doing routine things with our lives that are not, we can't be fully 24/7 doing only things related to the war and sitting and suffering and crying in a corner. We actually need to be able to recharge, and we need to be able to do things with our lives and in our lives that can help us like restore our energy to continue fighting and to continue sort of, going against Russian authoritarianism in all its forms. And I would ask Western people to not judge us for whatever we do and however we behave and whatever we do with our lives, because we're at a point in time where it's been 6 months, and we need to be able to be empowered and supported in deciding what we do with our lives moving forward, and not judged by different people.
Well, thank you very much, Val, for all of that and for answering our questions. Dom, you've been listening to this. Do you have any questions for Val?
Yeah, thanks, David. Hi, Val. Just a quick one, if I may. There's a really interesting article this week in The Economist that talks about the toll on mental health for Ukrainians in the country and elsewhere. And it refers to the government is trying to, even in these early days, trying to provide services and money to help in this regard. And I just wonder, Val, if you could give us a feel for whether or not Ukrainian society will respond in that way, and that sort of government down, provide money through programs, or is it sort of much more of a self-help type community-based work that will help us all get through this and help the Ukrainians get through this? And just finally, if that's the case, and is that kind of mainly happening in the sort of younger cohorts? How do you reach the older people?
Yeah. Well, I think the topic of mental health is such an important one, and I'm not sure that it's being discussed enough, and maybe right now is not the time, but I do think it is. One thing I would say, and I'm only speaking from personal experience because I don't like to generalize, but from my experience, I have experienced before the war, just in general as a Ukrainian, I've experienced sort of mental health being stigmatized in Ukraine, and I don't think we're at a point in time where people are fully aware of the fact that this is going to have extreme consequences for a lot of us for a long period of time into the future. And so I would just like to start with that, to say that, like, I think Ukraine is still, as a lot of sort of countries in Eastern Europe, where, there's still this like attitude sort of to keep your emotions within you and to not, deal with trauma and things like that. Whilst there's a lot of course, work being done, and a lot of people are, and like, as you say, younger generations are starting to talk about it, it's still not acknowledged 100%. And I think I was actually thinking about this when I was talking about this like low-key constant level of pressure that people are experiencing. I think that's going to have the biggest impact on people, to be completely honest. Yes, of course, the trauma and the experience of, seeing bombs fly across, over your building and things like that is going to be very significant as well. But I also think the constant low-key pressure that people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives is going to have a massive impact for a while, for many years to come. And so I think it has to be a combination of the things that you said, right? Like a government approach. It shows that the government is acknowledging the consequences that the war is having on people's mental health, but also from, civil society initiatives, from, as you said, bottom up. We, at Women's March, we have, for example, from the very first days of the war, we had a mental health helpline for women. And we're actually getting a lot of requests from women to speak to psychologists and things like that for, first mental health first aid, what is it called? Yeah, mental health first aid kind of sessions. But I do think that some people are acknowledging the consequences that this will have on mental health. A lot of people are not. And I do think that it needs to be a combined effort, as you said, of top-down and bottom-up approach to get people to really start paying attention to not just, their bodies, but their minds as well.
Well, thank you, Dom, and thank you, Val, for all of that. I think we're starting to run out of time, so I'll just ask both of you for your final thoughts. Dom, potentially, if you want to talk a little bit about strategically and tactically what people should be thinking of in the next few days over the weekend, and Val, it would be great to hear a little bit about Ukrainian spaces and how people can listen to that.
Well, I'll be very quick so that Val can have the last word. I mean, keep your eyes on Zaporizhia. There is this suggestion from Russia, caveated from Russia, that Ukraine are about to attack either today or tomorrow, which could be a false flag attack by Russia anyway. But because of the potential consequences there of an attack on a nuclear power station, that demands all our attention. And finally, the other attacks that have happened in the last 24 hours in Crimea. There's no suggestion these are going to stop. I was wondering yesterday on the podcast whether or not the military effect and the psychological effect was enough for whatever the team is that's there to consider it mission accomplished and head off. But it seems not. And the Western official we spoke to earlier on was saying that these are a powerful statement by Ukraine's, or a powerful statement of Ukraine's ability to operate in that way. And he specifically mentioned there's an uptick of unexplained events over the last 2 weeks, and there's no sign of that slowing down. So keep an eye on these small scale attacks behind the lines, and definitely keep your eye on Zaporizhia over this weekend.
Thank you, Dom. Val Voshchevska, would you like the final word?
Thank you so much, David. And once again, thank you for inviting me back. It's as I said, this is the first time I've actually spoken to anyone publicly about my experience of going back home. So it was therapeutic for me as well. But yeah, as always, one of the best ways to keep people paying attention to Ukraine, in my opinion, is to keep elevating the voices of Ukrainians, Ukrainian journalists and civil society leaders and activists and anyone with experience of Ukraine and with knowledge of Ukraine, which we all have. It's super important to keep paying attention to our opinions and our work. Which is what essentially Ukrainian Space is, the podcast and network that I co-founded together with Maxim Yuristavi does. So as well, you can listen to us. We're actually launching season 2 on Wednesday. You can listen to season 1. We have over 32 episodes already uploaded with different people from different backgrounds, all Ukrainian, talking about Ukraine and their experiences as well of living in Ukraine, growing up in Ukraine, but also touching upon really interesting topics, everything from literature to art to activism. So yeah, and first episode of season 2 will be on Wednesday on Twitter Spaces as well. So please watch out for that. And we're also 100% volunteer initiative that is funded by our patrons on Patreon. It's pinned, I think, to my profile as well. So if anyone wants to listen to us and support us, just find all the links on my profile.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.